Hello, everybody. So nice to see so many people in this. This is the biggest gallery that I've seen in ages. So the gallery view. So I'm so happy to see everybody here. So I'm Marcia Henry, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Gender Studies at LSE. I'm so excited about this panel. I've been kind of cooking this up in my mind for a long time in separate conversations with speakers. And yeah, so just to tell you a little bit about the format today, we're gonna start off with panelists speaking for around 7 minutes each, and then we're going to possibly return to each of the panelists just to kind of follow up on what others have said. And then we'll open it up for question and answer. So if you can, if you want to, you can put questions into the chat as we're going along. And Lucia Pedrioli, who has very kindly organized all of the technical aspects of this, is going to be there taking care of that. But you can also, in the question and answer, use the raise hand function, and we'll take some questions then. Okay, great. So I'm going to do, it's really my pleasure to do these introductions, but in a way I feel like what the speakers will have to say about Afrofeminisms and beyond will tell you so much more about their biographies and their research interests than the biographies that are available on the events page. But we're going to start off with Dr. Tony Hastrup, who is a senior lecturer in international politics at the University of Stirling. And she is interested in the gender dynamics and processes of change within regional security institutions. Tony's current research examines the practices and implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the African and European Unions. And in addition to teaching on international security issues, Tony is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Common Market Studies and co-convener of the UACES Research Network, Gendering EU Studies. So Tony's going to start, and then we're going to follow that up with Peace, Dr. Peace Meady, who is a senior lecturer in gender and international politics at the University of Bristol. And she is author of Global Norms and Local Action, the Campaigns to End Violence Against Women in Africa, which has been published last year by Oxford University Press, and the author of this amazing novel called His Only Wife. So we have plans to organize our own prize giving for Peace, but Peace has already won a number of accolades in regards to this. So I'm so glad that we also have the opportunity to talk about the kinds of interdisciplinary contributions of Afrofeminists and African feminists. Following that, we're going to hear from Dr. Yolande Bouka, who is assistant professor in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University. And she's an interdisciplinary scholar and practitioner with deep theoretical and methodological roots in critical international relations. Her research and teaching focus on gender, violence, decoloniality, race and international relations, and African affairs. The key questions driving her research agenda is how vulnerable groups understand and navigate structural and political violence, and how these experiences influence the post-conflict social and political landscapes. And her research has received support from the Fulbright Scholar Program, the American Association of University Women, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And it's a little bit early, so thank you very much, Yolande, for joining us from the early and cold atmosphere of Toronto. So thanks very much. And then following that, we're going to have Dr. Simidele Dosikun, who's assistant professor in the Department of Media and Communications at LSE. Her research centers Black African women to explore questions of gender, race, subjectivity, and power in a global context. And she is author of Fashioning Post-Feminism, Spectacular Femininity and Transnational Culture, also published in 2020 by University of Illinois Press. And her work has appeared in Feminist Media Studies, Feminism and Psychology, and Feminist Africa, among other journals. And her current research concerns Nigerian feminist hashtag campaign, being female in Nigeria. So I'm really, really so excited and happy to have had all of these scholars accept the invitation to speak today. And I will turn it over to Tony, please.
Thanks very much for inviting me to speak today. In agreement with my other panelists, we decided to read out a definition of Afrofeminism from Sylvia Tamale, which says, Afrofeminism shares some values with Western feminism. Afrofeminism distinctly seeks to create its own theories and discourses that are linked to the diversity of African realities. It works to reclaim the rich histories of Black women in challenging all forms of domination, in particular as they relate to patriarchy, race, class, sexuality, and global imperialism. And we thought that that was a good place to start because it was broad enough to accommodate the ways in which we might think about Afrofeminisms or African feminisms. So I think I first used the term African feminism in a book chapter that I wrote in 2013. So this was obviously after my PhD and after my first book. And it was an interesting process for me because a lot of the work that I do is via institutions. And usually that's not the place that people go to seek critical forms or critical understandings of feminism. So usually, you know, you have to be on the ground to do the research that is critical and therefore accepted as such. But in 2013, I did talk about African feminism because I've been thinking about it for a while. And so I wanted to give a bit of background to the research that I actually do and the ways in which African understanding or potentially the ways in which I think about feminism are impacted by Africa or Africanness. So first and foremost, I'm an African feminist. I think I mentioned this before we started. And in a lot of my work, I try to make sense of my own positionality, being here located in the global north, so to speak, and in the UK, specifically in a country that colonized the country that I identify with. And I often say to people that, you know, the older that I get and the longer that I live in the UK, the more that I feel Nigerian specifically. And I think that explains a lot of the ways in which I think about Africa and African informed feminisms. So in the context of my own work, I don't have a preconception as to what that might be, but I think that it's important to engage with sort of the theoretical traditions of African scholars and African feminist scholars, but not just that, but also the praxis of liberation that may or may not be defined as feminism in the strictest sense. And so then, if we sort of extrapolate that to working within the institution, what does that mean? Well, my own research in particular focuses on the relationship between Europe and Africa. And I look at this in the context of two institutions, the European Union and the African Union. Over the last 15 years or so, one of the things I've tried to understand is, you know, the nature and the quality of post-colonial relations. So we all know first independence, 1957 in Ghana, subsequent ones in the 1960s, and by now we should all be liberated. But of course, in the context of looking at that relationship, and nobody would be surprised, we still very much see a very negative, putting it politely, coloniality of power in function in the context of the relationship between these two institutions. And again, I want to reiterate, these two institutions are simply proxies they of themselves cannot capture the entirety of European relations or European domination of Africa. Now, what is unique about this specific relationship is, on the one hand, the African Union, by its very creation, sought to reinvent itself away from the prior institutional organization, which was very much in response to colonialism. And the European Union functions, or at least mythologizes itself as never having been involved in colonialism, and therefore should be exempt from some of those critiques. And so, my initial work for my PhD challenged this and said, how can the European Union, or back then the European Community, inscribed African countries into the treaty that founded European integration without the consent of these African countries, thereby determining the trajectory of that relationship? And in a way, my entry into African feminisms has been a way for me to make sense of the endurance of global power hierarchies, particularly between the European Union and African countries, via the African Union, when it doesn't admit, when there's no, there's contestation as to, the extent to which that prior European engagement in Africa actually impacts on the institution. And this has then led me to look at the nature of the relationship as a gendered and racialized one, the ways in which gender and race are treated within the relationship between the EU and the AU, but also the ways in which they're conceived in an African Union whose support comes primarily from the European Union, and a European Union that has been saying since 1957 that it wants a different relationship with Africans, one that is determined by Africans, and we still haven't seen it, obviously. And so in that sense, then, African feminism is for me, ongoing. It's not made, and has to depend on the practice. And I like to think, although I am located here in the global north, precisely because I'm located in the global north, I'm not allowed to forget that I'm very much African, and I don't want to forget. And in that sense, I like to think that I am part of that making process, right? So it's about what actually happens in practice, but it's also about how we theorize it. And I just want to end by saying, someone who's, all the people on the call today have very much influenced my thinking around this, particularly Yolande's work, but also peace, because peace works specifically on the women, peace and security issues, and gender and violence. But I also want to mention Awino K. Chatsoa's latest work around sort of feminist epistemic communities has been very much influential in my own recent thinking, but also important because it's helped me articulate perhaps more clearly why it is important to even relate and articulate the fact that there's something different about African feminisms. So I'll keep quiet, and then I look forward to subsequent conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very punctual. Thank you so much, Tony. Thanks, Peace. Can I turn it over to you?
Yes. Thank you, Marsha, for organizing this. Thank you, Lucia, for making it all come together. And thank you, Tony, for that great start. And I like what you said about African feminism being ongoing. And that's how I think about it. I think that as a movement, as a school of thought, as an idea, it's constantly growing, it's constantly changing. And for me, that just makes it very exciting, because I feel there's just so much more that we can contribute as scholars and as activists towards African feminism. And as you said, I've mostly used African feminisms and not Afrofeminism. So maybe that's also a conversation that that can be had. And for me, what excites me about African feminisms is partly this recognition that it's not only about patriarchal domination, but other forms of domination. It's about race, it's about class, it's about imperialism, it's about colonialism. And that makes it very exciting, but also very relevant. So my work has been in feminist international relations. Oh, have I been off for a while? Oh, okay. So my work has been on feminist international relations, specifically security. I've done work on gender-based violence, and I will admit that um, when I began this work, my focus really wasn't on African feminisms. But over time, as I've worked in this area, I just thought it was quite strange, as Marcia noted earlier, the absence um, of African feminism within. Whether it's gender and politics, gender and security, within this area, but also the extent to which the absence of African feminism, but also other non-Western feminisms, the extent to which their absence really, and I say two things, limits how we think about problems, how we understand problems, but also the solutions that we find to problems. So my argument has been that within I don't know what it's called in mainstream, I guess, within mainstream feminist IR, by not, for the most part, engaging with, for example, African feminisms, we are mostly providing partial answers to questions. And therefore, whatever recommendations that we are coming up with are going to be partial recommendations. I have two pieces that I've really written, and I think increasingly my work is moving towards a space where I'm thinking more about knowledge production and how we think about things, and who gets a seat at the table and gets to come up with ideas, and whose ideas are valued. But I've had a couple of pieces that I published recently, and one was on the it was an analysis of Gender and Politics Journal, but also of the extent to which the global South tends to be missing from gender and politics scholarship, and how the impact that global political and economic forces have on women globally, but particularly in the global South, tends to be ignored. And this is something that African feminists, when they talk about multiple forms of domination, so not only patriarchy, but also class and colonialism, this is something that they very much emphasize. And there's, for example, there's very interesting work on sexual violence and the extent to which global forces play an important role in the occurrence of sexual violence or the perpetration of sexual violence, including wartime sexual violence. Yet most of the scholarship on this topic locates the problem only at the domestic level. So the problem is only explained by what's happening within the state. And this is not to say what happens within the state is not important, but we also know that global forces have a role to play in what happens domestically. And so my point is that, going back to the point about partial explanations, I feel that in any, well, for the most part, scholarship that is ignoring these global forces are going to provide partial explanations. And the fact is that a lot of this scholarship is seeking to change things, is seeking to transform. But if we are trying to transform based on partial explanations, what kind of transformation can we expect to see? I also actually just published a piece a couple of days ago, and it was on the need to study structures. And this really comes out of my first piece on it's in the European Journal of Politics and Gender on the location of global South scholars and ideas. But my point in this piece was why or how we need to pay attention to structures, to systems, to institutions in trying to really understand gender inequality globally, but also how to address the problem. And once again, I tie this back to the work of African feminists who have over and over again said that it's not only about the patriarchy, that we need to pay attention to these other forces, these other structures that impact women's lives. And so I think my work keeps coming back to this point about how we need to look at global political and economic forces. I'm also very interested in, and also African feminisms is also about the various realities within Africa, right? Because there's so much variation across the continent. And I'm really interested in the stories that we don't tell, the stories that are not heard. My current project is on women traditional leaders, and I'm just so very excited about this project. And that when we talk about women in politics, women traditional leaders who historically and now play such an important role have almost been absent from the conversation about women in politics. But we do know that the average woman is not going to speak to the president or to a member of parliament. She's going to, I mean, if I come from Ghana. If you're in Ghana, you're going to your queen mother to talk about a problem that you're having. So for me, it's also, African feminism is also about shining a light and kind of interrogating all of these institutions and these structures domestically that tend not to be covered in what I'll call again the mainstream literature on issues of women.
Sorry, I don't know what happened.
Yes, and so in a nutshell, that's how this thinking about African feminisms has influenced my research that I'm doing now. And I think it's just really pushing me to go beyond my own work to think broadly about knowledge production and about the limitations of knowledge production. I decided to get a PhD because I partly and maybe naively thought it would help me solve real world problems. I mean, and there's still hope. But what part of my frustration has been, well, if we are producing knowledge that isn't particularly helpful, how exactly can we use it to solve real world problems? So I think I'm very interested in how we can make scholarship work better for us. And then I also write fiction, which is another way in which I explore a lot of the issues that I cover in in my research, in my teaching. And it's just been fun in my book writing about, I guess, Africa in a way that people, or writing about an African country in a way that people outside of Africa are not used to reading. And I guess kind of just showing this diversity within Ghana. And I think one of the best parts about publishing the book for me was people who grew up in Ghana, grew up in the town where I grew up, in that I write about in a book, who were like, I've never seen my town in a novel before. This is so exciting. And so that to me is just also very important, that people will grow up, young people are going to read about themselves in literature, because feminism, I mean, it's not only about scholarship, it's not only about activism, it's about art, it's about culture. And I very much want all of this to be a part of my work. I have no idea if I've gone over the time. I hope not. Thank you.
Thank you, Yolande.
I definitely love the way Peace ended her remarks, because then it allows me to kind of pick up where she left off. Peace wrote her novel on Ghana, but because I'm from neighboring Togo, many of the expressions and the dynamics that she explores in her book, even some of the names she uses, are so close to me. There are several family members whose name I find in her book, and I remember reading it and texting her in the middle of the night and saying, "Oh my gosh, this happened to my mother. Oh my gosh, this is my aunt's story." And it's actually extraordinary, particularly for somebody from Togo who, well, a lot of people don't even know where it is on the map. To find my family's stories in a book, it's extraordinary. So first of all, I want to thank Peace for writing and for continuing to write and showing, use what you learn and what you live and share it in a creative form. Because we need creatives. We need this type of production of knowledge. And I also want to kind of echo her sentiments about the frustrations with regards to knowledge production about various fields. I situate myself in political science and on the margins. I'm a marginal IR theorist because I think very much outside of the mainstream. And my commitment has been about, particularly for the past few years, has been about normalizing the use of scholarship produced by Black women. And this is the reason why I'm very comfortable with this, Afrofeminism location. For a variety of reasons. First, I no longer live and work in Africa. I am, back in the West, and I think there's also some ethical consideration about the space that I occupy, not only in terms of location, but also in terms of the power dynamics in terms of visibility. I don't want to make claims about African feminisms that don't recognize the ways in which Black feminism in North America has influenced my thinking. So this is one of the reasons why I feel very comfortable there. I also see linkages between the scholarships, between historical events. I've often said that I'm a failed historian. I should have been a historian and not somebody that studies politics. I'm more interested in history. Well, partly because our discipline relies so much on historical facts, and my frustration is what's missing from the historical accounts. So among other things that I'm doing at the moment, one of my main research project tries to look at the ways women have participated in large episodes of violence in Africa. More specifically, I'm focusing on the Namibian liberation struggle. And there's a whole story behind why I'm interested in this story. It's quite personal. I have a friend that I had known for 10 years before I found out that she was born in exile from, of a mother who joined the People's Liberation Army of Namibia as a older teenager. And that to me was problematic because I thought, I know what happened in Angola and the Namibian forces, but I did not know the extent to which women were involved in that process. And I was an adult. I was finishing my PhD when I heard that story. And that stayed in the back of my head because I kept thinking, I've met this woman so many times. I've engaged with her, and yet there was a portion of her life and an experience that is clearly tied to African nationalism and women's revendication of their rights, particularly African women trying to liberate themselves from that double yoke we talk about of patriarchy and colonialism that I did not know. And that made me highly uncomfortable. And my idea was to try to unearth or excavate some of these stories. And some countries are better covered than others. South Africa, for instance, has a pretty rich scholarship about women in liberation struggles, but maybe not as much, Namibia, where you have Ellen Namhila or Martha Akawa, who've written some stuff and some fantastic scholarship. And some of it is, based on oral history that's still not making it out there, even in feminist scholarship. So even in the scholarship that we are claim to be our own, this scholarship is not there. And there was a couple of reasons why I wanted to focus on this project. The first is because the war in Angola is one of the largest military engagements in the history of Africa. It changed the trajectory of the Cold War. And women were there. African women were there in the thick of things. And here is not an attempt to romanticize women's participation in these armed rebellions. They participated in various shapes and forms. But it's also to understand, even within the groups that they participate in, there was an evolution of thinking, groups that claim to have Marxist ideas about gender equality. Even within these particular groups, there was an evolution of how they treated women and how women had to navigate their space. So for me, it's really about engaging with that scholarship, and sometimes you have to excavate it in order to draw more robust conclusions about issues of DDR, for instance. If we are not understanding the role that African women played 30, 40 years ago, what makes us think that we can draw long-term conclusions about what DDR means for women in contemporary context, right? So for me, it was also problematic because Namibian women were key in developing the women, peace, and security agenda, and it's completely erased from, when we're celebrating the anniversary of the WPS, we're actually not celebrating the intellectual history, the physical history of some of the key actors in drafting and pushing for these documents. And a lot of these women came from Southern Africa. So for me, the commitment to African feminisms and Afrofeminisms is really about engaging critically in the intellectual and political and security contributions of Black women around the world, in Africa, and in the diaspora. So I want to talk. I also think that feminist works require shouting out people who are doing this kind of work and the type of work that inspires my thinking. So I know that I want to give a couple examples, and I've written them down because I don't want to forget them, right? So in South Africa, Professors Mugugwana Babalwa and Professors Sipokazi Magadla and Atimbele Masola are writing or hoping to write. They're working on an African woman's intellectual history book. They're editing this volume that seeks to unearth kind of the contributions of African women to political science, to politics and security. There is at the moment going on the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, where you have a panel. And I want to name the names. It's recorded so people can pause and rewind and look for people's scholarship. Kate Cosby, Annie Hikido, Lashonda Carter, Jordan Layton, Lisa Baird, and Onyekachi Okweju, who are presenting on their work gathering oral history of Black women in politics. Right? This is a type of necessary work that we have to do, because if we don't do it, people are not that interested in doing this gathering and unearthing. The book that Nwando Achebe wrote recently at Ohio Press, kind of documenting the various ways in which Black women, African women specifically, in history prior to the colonial encounter, but during colonial resistance, really accessed, navigated, and wielded power, right? Normalizing these discussions, because in my work in policy, when I encounter African men in politics or in security who constantly tell me, traditionally, African women are not interested in these types of spaces. They like to stay home and behind the private sphere. And I'm like, which tradition are we talking about exactly? Is it the tradition that was imposed on us by, Western conceptions of binary gender constructions? I mean, is that the tradition you're referring to? Or what actually was the reality of many African women prior to the colonial encounter? And I want to finish with some of the pushback that I also get. When I talk about Queen Jinga, people are like, oh yeah, but this one in Angola, Queen Jinga was a queen who in modern day Angola who resisted Portugal's colonial conquest for many years, right? And it ended up taking the Portuguese and the Dutch getting together in order to push her out. So this is also something to think about, like the level of the possibilities of military strategies that these women were able to deploy. And people will tell me, but she's an exception, right? When I'm like, okay, well, what about Queen Poku, right? Who is the founding mother of the Baoulés in contemporary Côte d'Ivoire? And you can name some of them. And then what about Nanny of the Maroons, right? Nanny of the Maroons is an Akal woman who was taken, I know there's different myths of origins about how she made her way to Jamaica during the slave era and co-led a liberation movement of the Maroons in Jamaica. And she used part of the knowledge about military strategy and politics that she had acquired on the African continent. So for me, my commitments to Afrofeminism is a deeply personal gut one in terms of wanting to reclaim this scholarship and using it in my contemporary political analysis of power and politics in Africa. And I will stop there.
Thank you. Simidele, can I ask you to go now, please?
Yeah, thank you. So thank you. Firstly, thank you to Marsha for bringing us here, convening this panel, and thank you to my co-panelists and for your, really insightful remarks. So I've just been jotting down some notes furiously as people were speaking, and also thinking about, my own kind of route into what I call African feminisms, and I'll say a few words on why, I suppose for now, at least, that I'm still on that name, stuck with it. But so yeah, let me start by, I think what Yolande was just saying towards the end of your remarks about tradition, I think is a nice point for me to also maybe begin. So essentially, I was thinking my route into this field, if you want to call it that, and certainly as kind of scholarly field and space, and a space of knowledge production. So I did my first, I'm from Nigeria, like Tony, and I grew up in Nigeria, but I did my first degree in the States. And when in my final year, at the point when I and my friend, everybody was figuring out what next, and people were applying to master's programs and, applying for jobs and so on, I was quite adrift. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I actually applied to the LSE, but I didn't, I accepted a place at the LSE, but I ended up not coming because I felt dissatisfied. I knew that I didn't really want to do that. And so at that time, Amina Mama, who is somebody that I have a personal relationship with, and subsequently now also have a working relationship with, she was the chair of the African Gender Institute at the University of Cape Town at the time. So I remember having a conversation with her where I said, I want to do gender studies or women's studies in Africa. And I had this thing about Africa, I want to come back to Africa. So I decided to apply for a master's at the AGI. Although I remember Amina saying to me, which I didn't comprehend until I went to Cape Town and spent 18 months there, when I kept saying, I want to come back to Africa, she was, she had to sort of say, hold on a minute, we're talking about Cape Town here. Let's just be clear on the nature of the place that you think you're coming back to. It's not Lagos, it's not Nigeria, it's the different, kind of, obviously different context, and in terms of the continued coloniality of that particular sort of space. Anyway, so I went to the AGI, and I think even to this day, I don't think I fully understand and appreciate just how formative and how enriching that experience was for me. It wasn't an easy experience for many reasons to do with Cape Town and South Africa, and some of the tensions and politics of being a Nigerian there. So it wasn't easy personally, but intellectually it was so enriching and generative to be in that space. And for me, from that time, and I would say ever since, I suppose I have seen myself and I have felt myself to be situated in a community of African feminist scholars, including people like Sylvia Tamale, who we referenced at the beginning, and Amina Mama herself, and other people.
And while I was there in Cape Town, I was invited to give a talk. So, I mean, I was a master's student. I was invited to give a talk at a graduate student symposium or something like that. So I gave a talk entitled Defending Feminism in Africa, which was subsequently, I was then asked to, or invited to publish it in the UCT graduate student journal, which I did. And somewhat, I mean, I somewhat cringe because I mean, I published it and it's out there and I see that it still gets cited. And I sort of think, oh my God, I wrote it when I was a master's student. And also it was a talk. So the style of it is quite polemical. But basically, so I mean, as I said, it was entitled Defending Feminism in Africa. And for me, the argument that I made there, although perhaps I didn't quite have the language that I would use now, I was really trying to kind of make an anti-essentialist argument about feminism in Africa, or trying to resist the essentialist. So again, to draw on what Yolande was saying, the kind of the references to tradition. This is not really, it's un-African, it's not part of our tradition and so on. Even though empirically speaking, that is clearly untrue. But also for me, at a deeper level, I mean, the way I gave or framed that talk, this is one of the reasons why I cringe when I see that people cite it. But it was very much this thing of, okay, so what? First of all, I don't agree that feminisms are not African. Empirically speaking and historically speaking, but even if feminism isn't African, so what? In the sense that, is that therefore grounds for African women to say that actually this is something that we reject? What is the value of feminism? Let's interrogate. And I mean, feminism, of course, we then have to say, well, what is feminism? Again, to refer to the definition that we started with, that, well, Sylvia Tamale says Afrofeminism, but if we say African, or I would say African, that again, it's about us as African women and feminists and thinkers and so on, defining it for ourselves and specifying what the content of it is and the relationships of our feminisms to other feminisms, Western feminisms included, but also others as well, because again, of course, there are many others as well that themselves also get overlooked or tend to get overlooked. So I think for me, I think since then, and certainly in my, in my current work or in my, my recently published book, I suppose I find myself constantly making or having to make or feeling that I have to make, again, this kind of anti-essentialist argument to allow certain things into the African context, even if they become things that we subsequently want to problematize. And so for me, like in my first book is about post-feminism. And post-feminist, what I argue is a certain kind of post-feminist self-making in the contemporary African context, in particular in the context of Lagos, and very much looking at elite Nigerian women. So, for me, I start that book by essentially saying, well, for me, again, there are two lines to the argument. One is that empirically speaking, in terms of what we see, if we simply look around, that I start the book by arguing, and it was my PhD project. It started with my feeling and my observing that there's something happening on the ground culturally that looks like this thing called post-feminism in the literature. But of course, in the literature, post-feminism at the time, I mean, this was 10 years or so when I started this project 10 years ago. African women, of course, would not be in that literature. African women couldn't be conceived. African women were like, in terms of the imagination, were precisely the kind of constitutive outsiders of such a thing as post-feminism. African women as, imagined as the people who are still in need of feminism or in need of women's empowerment. How could we be thinking of them as thinking of themselves as post that? Anyway, so as I said, I make an empirical argument that it's here, it's on the ground, but also again, this trying to get away from ideas that again, that there's a right way to be an African woman, and therefore, a wrong way, and that certain things are not allowed. And I do so, and I think it's important to do so, but at the same time, for me, there's a certain ambivalence. Well, there's an ambivalence as to the kind of almost maybe the implications, perhaps, or the consequences of some of these arguments. So for instance, I mean, okay, so again, my book is about post-feminism in Africa. So I start by saying African women are, or some, I mean, again, a very kind of elite slice, are or can be also imagining themselves as and producing themselves as and buying into this so-called culture, this culture called post-feminism. But then I do so as to then proceed to criticize it or to critique it, so it's not, I often feel that I'm kind of walking a fine line between making a celebratory, what may seem like a celebratory argument about African self-making, or African women's self-making or capacity to self-make, vis-a-vis, you know, certain cultural practices that we might then want to problematize. So to give another example, in my book, I mount a defense of the weave, even though I also, you know, want to critique the weave, for instance. But my argument is that the critique is in the African context is not on the grounds of, again, it's not on essentialist and nativist grounds, that this thing is not allowed for certain kinds of people, or it's about self-hating and so on and so forth. Another quick point that I'll just say is because of the nature of my work, so I mean, broadly speaking, it's on popular media and consumer cultures in the African context, but, you know, very much thinking about that. Well, I think, again, empirically, I think we can't but think of them as globalized cultures. So essentially, my work is very much about, it's centered on African women in the African context, although the kinds of women I study are also very mobile in different kinds of ways. But it's very much about thinking about because of the cultural practices that I study, it's also about connectivities between African women and elsewhere, or between Africa and elsewhere, which, you know, again, in my work it's, you know, so very much, somebody said this earlier, so I can't remember who, I think it was Tony, very much kind of drawing on, and Yolande also said this as well, drawing on Black diasporic feminist scholarship. You know, so my work is very much, and my thinking is very much in conversation with that, but doing so again in ways that are not, or trying to do in ways that are, again, are not sort of essentialist. So not assuming that what is said about Black women in America can simply be transplanted to the African context. Of course it can't, but at the same time seeing that, again, there's something about Blackness, certainly in popular media and consumer culture, that circulates, that travels, and so on. I mean, so part of my argument actually in the book is that, if anything, there's a certain kind of racializing that happens in the Nigerian context, precisely through the Black diaspora, right? And again, a certain sort of consumption of Blackness, and again, imagination of transnational Blackness. So that's one sort of important empirical, but again, also conceptual connectivity that I make in my work, but then also global South, other kinds of global South connections. So in my work and in my thinking, I very much draw on transnational feminist cultural studies. And in particular, when you look at that sort of body of feminist scholarship, it's really, I mean, I'm sure there are reasons why, and people have kind of explored why, but it's very much, the kind of work that I draw on, it's very much coming out of, although maybe people are institutionally based in North America, but it's very much about South Asia, and in particular India, more particularly India. So you know, so again, here I am studying African women in the African context, but very much sort of finding myself thinking about India and new femininities in the Indian context, and drawing on this literature that is referring or concerned with women in that context, also drawing kind of post-colonial and post-British imperial connections and so on to that sort of space. So again, for me, African feminisms and my approach to the study of African women, again, is precisely about putting them in conversation with these other places and these other bodies of scholarship. And then the final thing, sorry, I don't know how long I've spoken for, I hope I haven't gone over. The final thing I just wanted to say is on the naming, the Afro-African. So I suppose for me, as I said, maybe I haven't really thought about it enough, but for now I'm sticking with African. And I think the reason why is because I guess for me, African feminism for me is about Africa, and I think this, you know, still in line with what I've already been saying, it's about Africa as the kind of contextual, Africa and even Africanness as the contextual and conjunctural ground of our concern and of our kind of analysis and so on. But again, recognizing that is obviously it's constructed, it's itself fluid, you know, Africa and Africanness is not only in Africa. And I think even as we are in conversation with Black and other, well, let me focus on Black, but let's say Black or Afro-descended, we could say, peoples elsewhere. Again, it's that thing about recognizing that yes, there's a global or transnational Black community, and they're racializing processes that put us in a certain kind of community, but that there are also differences, and it's important to recognize them. And also that, so again, that we can't just simply, these different feminisms are not simply interchangeable, even as they are closely connected and closely in conversation. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much in all of what you've said. And I wonder if you would allow me to not go back to you in the first instance, but to open up for some questions, and hopefully that will also give you an opportunity to respond to points made by the other panelists in answering those. What do you think? Is there any, or unless there's anybody that wants to sort of urgently respond to points more recently made?
I'd like to just add, when we're talking about what African feminisms are, what do they represent? Going back, I think, to Simi's point about the varieties, and I think Peace also made that point, the diversities of feminism. Right? There's one point that I think there's one story or one anecdote that really points to that. If you're on social media, you have various groups of feminists who are on Twitter, and there's, they obviously don't represent everybody in their own location with regards to their ideas and formulation about what feminism is in their own locale. But we periodically have, even within our young African women engaging in feminist research, disputes that are very much rooted in geography. East African feminists, West African feminists, and South African feminists. Often it's the East and West that I, for some reason, probably because of professional and personal connection, I'm much more connected to these networks. But periodically, there's going to be, there has been back and forth about, who's doing real feminism. And of course, these are simply, it's a caricature. It's probably like it's not an archetype of the relationship that these feminist groups have with one another, but they also speak to the diversities that are linked to culture, geography, relationship with the international. And as somebody who does international relations, I cannot help but think also in terms of the implications for connections across oceans. And we look, for instance, at Southern Africa, right? The role that military engagement for liberation has played in creating space for women, and the type of legal infrastructures that they have to promote the representation, descriptive representation of women in places. Very progressive laws on genders and sexuality in South Africa, and yet, we do know, that femicide is a huge problem. It's a problem across the world, but in South Africa, it's particularly, the shape it takes is particularly problematic. And then you have this kind of East and West Africa, where in West Africa, at least my reading and my understanding speaks to a very strong history of women's engagement in the economy in West Africa that predates the colonial encounter, which is linked to, despite colonialism, a very strong sense of women's economic empowerment when you compare it to, East Africa. And in East Africa, you also have varieties, variations. How does, Kenya is the kind of regional economic power of the region, and yet they can't seem to get their act together with regards to implementing their 2/3 rule, right? But in terms of discourse, what I hear often from East African women that are on social media platforms is that, West African feminism is still too linked to tradition and the patriarchy. And then there's the way back in terms of we're economically empowered. We do things in our own way. So even within the umbrella of African feminism, there is a great deal of diversity, but the diversity is not always kumbaya diversity. It's also sometimes picking at one another and flashing a light on maybe some of the challenges that our own regional feminism have that we could improve on. But it's not always cordial conversations. So that's something that I wanted to put out there as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That's a nice addition to what's already been said. I see that, unless I'm not looking at the chat correctly, are there questions in the chat? No, does anybody have, oh, we have some questions, raised hands. From what I can see, Lydia, can I ask you?
Hi, yes, thank you. Thank you so much for organising this event and for making this happen. All of the remarks that have been made so far have been so interesting and so insightful, and it's just fantastic to see something like this taking place, so thank you. I'm really interested and intrigued by this conversation that's going on around kind of African feminisms and Afrofeminism, and if I can bring in also Black feminism and what the differences between those are and within those are, and also kind of this idea about location and how things move across space. And one thing that really strikes me is that often when we talk about Black diaspora or transnational Blackness, how much of a part the US plays in this, and how sometimes I have the impression that we don't talk very much about what African feminism or Afrofeminism or Black feminism might look like in Europe specifically. So I'm wondering whether you might be able to speak to whether there are any particularities that emerge when we think about these forms of feminism within Europe. I mean, obviously that it's quite a big question because there are so many feminisms, and but yeah, I'm just wondering about what this looks like specifically in Europe, and if you might be able to speak to that.
Okay, great. I can't see everybody who's in this session and whether there's hands raised. So but maybe we want to go, I mean, maybe I can, I think we'll take a couple of questions and then we'll ask the panelists to respond. Sarah?
Hello.
Hi.
Yes, so this is Sarah from Libya, and I just wanted, oh, sorry, I have a background. Sorry, I cannot move it right now. So anyway, it's just to follow up on Lydia, I think, his question when she said what's Black feminism and what's African feminism. And my question is, does African feminism include also North African? And if not, then why do we call it African and not Black feminism? And if it is, to what extent are they actually involved in the different studies and the different definitions of the African feminism? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm looking to see if there's more raised hands. Okay. Shall I put you on the spot, Tony, to start that off?
Right. Okay. So those are really great questions. I mean, I guess I don't necessarily have a all-encompassing definitive answer, but I'll try to make sense of those questions in the context of how I think about it through the process of my own work. I think that especially within sort of international studies, they're very fuzzy lines, right? So when I think about what African feminism might mean to me and what uses it might have, I also think of the Combahee River Collective, which, you know, is, if the critique is very Black American. And I mean, perhaps as a West African, I do feel a certain affinity for that, you know, going back to Yolande's point about failed historian, I share that sentiment daily, that I think that there's that affinity that I feel like I can't really get rid of. So I do see that there are fuzzy lines between the ways in which Black feminism in North America has been conceptualized. But of course, there's also a limitation to that. Part of that limitation is I was educated in the United States first, right? So I did my PhD here, but it was the last bit of my formal education. So there's a certain newness to the European conceptualizations of Black feminism. That said, again, going back to diasporic work, the edited collection by Francesca Shobande and I'm blanking a second. Akugo Imejulu is fantastic, and I think articulates very well those precise connections, and actually I think reinforces that fuzziness. But I think, then linked to the second question around, where, how does this situate, say North Africa? You might recall that when I was speaking initially, one of the things I said is, for me, African feminism is still being made and will continue being made. And I imagine Black feminism is. And part of the reason for that is because, again, based on my location, raised in Nigeria, moved to the US, so, I think Simidele and I have sort of followed each other through South Africa and then the UK. There's a certain bias there, right? So Sub-Saharan Africa and all of that. And so now, in the context of my own work, and in particular in the context of women, peace, and security, I do have to lean on the oral knowledge of people who are based in North Africa. And I engage specifically with people, feminist activists based in Egypt and working in Tunisia and working in Algeria. And recently I've been sort of doing some work on feminist foreign policy and French colonial legacies in Algeria. And that is all new to me, but I think that's where the practice bit becomes really important, that we can't just assume that, these theories already exist and we're going to take them and apply them and then we'll create new knowledge, but actually that, this process of knowledge production is ongoing and has to rely on not just those people who are either dead, older, or already done, but that, we are also part of that making. And for me, that's where North Africa would come in. And for that reason, I think it would still be very appropriate to think about this idea of African feminisms.
Thank you, Tony. Can I ask Simidele? Can I ask you?
Yeah, if I may just speak. So just to the first question, I mean, I don't feel that I can speak to the question of Afro or Black, or again, whatever the prefix might be, feminisms in Europe, even though I should be able to, because here I am in Europe myself. And I mean, certainly for me, that is a bit of a tension, actually, is that, I'm located in this country, I've been here for 10 years now, but I don't feel of it. And I don't feel able to speak about certain things in this context. In terms of race and gender and so on. But I think absolutely Lydia's point is absolutely spot on observation that, again, that there is a dominance of Black America. And I think we need to recognize that, and it goes without saying. And actually precisely what part of what that is the dominance of America itself. There's a geopolitical relationship there that comes through in the scholarship and cultural life, Black cultural life and Black scholarship and so on. And I think, yes, so yes, it's clear that is there. And I think, to sort of reiterate the point that I was making earlier, which I mean, I think it's an obvious point, and I suspect this is also what Lydia was kind of getting at. I think one of the, we engage with Black American scholarship. I think we can't not, and it's obviously very rich, it's very useful, it's very generative, but I think also that we can recognize some of its limitations. So for instance, and it's not really a critique, it's just a kind of observation that, a lot of Black American feminist work, it's very much about the American context. And I mean, that's fine, but there isn't a transnational view. And there isn't necessarily a kind of a thinking about the nation in the American state and nation in geopolitical context. So the concern is very much about what the American state as it impacts on the Black American experience. And again, rightly so, but there's a lens that's missing. So my view is that I would suggest we as Black feminists elsewhere, that we take what we need and what works from that body of scholarship, but then also that we recognize that we have to do other work as well to kind of develop theory for our various contexts, whether that's Europe or Africa. And then finally, on the question of North Africa, Sarah's question, I mean, yes, I think absolutely. I mean, I think a number of us on the panel, we recently contributed to a new handbook on African women's studies. And the chapter that I was asked to write, which I did write, is an overview of African feminisms. And one of the points that I make in the chapter is precisely that, what Sarah was getting at, which is that actually when we talk about Africa, the question of, okay, what is the Africa, or even where is the Africa and African feminisms? One of the answers, and I think it's a fact, is that we mostly mean sub-Saharan Africa, right? So North Africa does tend to be missing from that. And I think that's, on the one hand, I think that's an omission, and it's something that we need to correct. But I also think, and I think this gets at what Yolande was also saying earlier, I think we also, again, as African feminists, I mean, we need to have some of these difficult internal conversations, actually, about some of the isms and tensions and so on between us. One of which is racism, actually. So we need to have a conversation about, again, some of the tensions between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, but then also, as Yolande was saying, East and West. And, I alluded to it earlier that, my experience of being a Nigerian in South Africa was quite difficult. I feel that I experienced xenophobia in the South African context as a Nigerian. Part of the xenophobia I experienced was, oh, but you don't look Nigerian, so that's good. Like you can pass as something else, which, why would I want to do that? So again, I think we need to clearly recognize that, yes, we talk about African feminisms, but it doesn't mean, as Yolande said, it's not a kumbaya situation, right? There are all kinds of tensions, and not to mention class, rural-urban divides, sexuality. That's a major tension, I think, maybe less so now, but historically, and certainly in that chapter I wrote reviewing the literature, there was a very explicit homophobia in African feminist scholarship at a certain point. Again, I hope and believe it's less the case now, but all those tensions are there, and we need to engage with them and be honest about them, as uncomfortable as they may be.
Thank you. I might ask, Peace, one of the things that you said when you were speaking earlier, which I just, really resonated for me, was about people reading your work, or at least reading a particular genre of your work and being able to see themselves. And so I think, everybody, the task of working in the space between African and Afrofeminism is clearly one with a very heavy set of weights of what needs to be done and who needs to be incorporated. And I just thought what you'd said about your audience, and I really liked that at least that is one audience that you're writing for, young women from the community that you grew up in, but also, around the world, transnationally, to have that replicated. So I was wondering if you could just comment on the previous questions around, around African and Afrofeminisms and their relationship to Europe as well.
Thank you, Marsha, and thank you, Tony and Simi, because you've said, I agree with a lot of what you said. Tony, you talk about fuzziness, and that's exactly how I feel thinking about it. I think this is something I need to sit and think for an extended period of time to kind of come up with a really good answer to this. But as we're all speaking, what I could think about was more than what sets them apart, it's what brings them together, the connections, the focus on intersecting oppressions, right? Whether you're talking about Afrofeminism, Black feminism, African feminisms, the different forms, East, West, North African, we're all focused on these intersecting oppressions. And for me, I think that's very important. Not to say that we don't need to talk about how they are different, but I think I understand more how they are similar than how they are different. And thinking about Black feminisms, as I was speaking, I was thinking about how when I think about feminists mobilizing in Ghana now, it's very much young women. A lot of it is young women, but interestingly, also a lot of people are not even based in Ghana, right? You have people based in Europe, people based in North America, and partly thanks to social media, to the internet, we're having people who are not in Ghana, but are very active in this space and are pushing for change, are pushing for transformation, are pushing to hold the government accountable. And you can see in the language that they use and how they go about their activism, they're very much influenced by whatever is happening in Europe, by the language that's being used, by the tactics that's being used. And so I think, just back to my original point about this, what I see more when I think about these forms of feminisms is more the connections and the things that kind of bring them together more than how they're different. I definitely need to think more about the ways in which they differ. Let's leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peace. Yolande?
A couple of things. So when we're thinking about the place that North American, particularly American Black feminism, the place that it takes, or the space that it takes around the world, well, I want to, echo what Sime is talking about in terms of, the space that empire takes intellectually in various disciplines, whether we're talking at least from political science or media studies, or, there's a varieties of ways in which that, American intellectual space takes actually a lot of space. And yes, I think there are absolutely limitations in terms of what is applicable based on geography and based on political context and history, right? What shapes the history of these political movements? Even if you look in Africa, for instance, when I speak to my students about armed mobilization of women, I speak about what the repertoires were based on the relationship with the colonial encounter. Not everybody went to war for independence. So not everybody could have participated in armed rebellion. That's part of a different types of repertoire. So even when we look at various African contexts and we look at the apartheid state in South Africa or in the United States, these were framing the repertoires of mobilization and intellectualization of the struggle these people were actually dealing with. But I think about Bell Hooks and Angela Davis and the extent to which over the course of their lives have also developed a great sensitivity to the role of their empire that has a boot on their neck, but that they're still somewhat a part of, and its impact on other people around the world. So even within Black feminist thought, there are varieties of preoccupations and alignments and ability or willingness to recognize the relationship with the outside. And that's only North America. And I haven't actually talked about Canadians because there is also scholarship coming out of Canada. I mean, so much. But, other places that we forget is Caribbean feminists, right? Or even Francophone feminists. In the past few months, years, I've gotten so excited about the scholarship that French feminists and the scholarship and advocacy. When we're thinking about Rokhaya Diallo, if you're in the UK on the other side, and her strength, her intelligence, her capacity to really kind of put herself out there and explain the feminism that she is referring to based on her position in the Hexagon, it's absolutely phenomenal. But you also have scholars like Annette Joseph Gabriel, who is bringing forth the scholarship of various Black women, Suzanne Césaire, Evelyn Trujillo, and the type of intellectual contributions they've made to Pan-Africanism and their role in Black feminism, from the Francophone side of, the rest of, the French Empire, but from a Black perspective. So, and then that's not even getting us started on Afro-Latinas, they're not also part often in this kind of broader conversation about Black feminist. If we're really going to use global Black feminist thought, as piece, what brings it together? But also what are the differences and how are those repertoires of intellectualizing their position and their revendication informed by their geographical, historical, and even cultural location? And the last thing that I want to mention is that they may be informed by these geographical and nationalist differences, but if they come from, if they are Black in this world, we know history, right? If they are Black in this world, there are traditions that are passed on the repertoires of mobilization in North America are very much informed by what was passed down from slaves who came, or from enslaved people who came from Africa. So there's this beautiful mosaic of similarities and divergences from which we can draw. And if we learn to bring them together, I think, this issue of Blackness and anti-Blackness is worldwide, right? And ultimately, I think if we can emancipate ourselves from that together, I think it should be the objective.
Great, thank you so much for all of your comments. I have a couple of comments in the chat, and I want to share them with you, and maybe I can ask Eliza if she can speak to her chat message. Where are you, Eliza?
Yes, oh, hi. Yeah, thank you so much for this very good conversation. I'm happy I came, and especially also to hear the discussions that went in today. I do feminism at the grassroots, and this means working with the women, caregivers, and widows, and especially girls, those who don't have a voice and whose voices sometimes may not make it to feminism, given the gatekeeping that also takes place in terms of what feminism is seen as the best, or as having a voice. But I made a comment about, I think it was Yolande, and the whole issue, of course, I come from Kenya, of Kenya being an economic giant, and the fact that we've not been able to maybe put our acts together. And I said, maybe even having 2/3, make it to the constitution itself is something like of a big step, in the sense that, and I was just thinking that perhaps because we are also an economic giant, then it means we also have to push harder for patriarchy itself, and also because, there's a patriarchal dividend to be drawn out of this being such also an economic giant. So I thought that is also something to do, and also in terms of celebrating the small changes and the small changes within feminism movement itself. I don't want to mention Rwanda, because maybe somebody else is from Rwanda may also be listening. Of course, they've done a little bit better in terms of having many, women in the parliament and all that. But then also looking at the voice, and there's a lot of discussion around whether representation itself is a change, or whether this space that maybe we would see more in Kenya for women and for feminism is what we can also use to gauge how progressive in terms of women empowerment a country is. So I thought that is also something to think about when we are comparing feminisms in terms of representation, and also whether we are looking at the different spaces and the actual voice of women in these spaces. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eliza. Maybe I have two other people who've said something in the chat, and I wonder if they wanted to just have a chance to reiterate those. Lisa, did you want to say?
Hi. Oh, sorry, I don't really need to take time with this. I just wanted to say thank you so much, and to bring up the issue, which is that I've been appreciating trying to understand a lot more about the history of Americans. That's why I wrote, as I am an American who studies African issues and have worked with and on African feminism for quite a while. One of the issues which I think is quite important is to figure out how this good distinction that our panelists have made between Afrofeminism and African feminism has in some ways been used in some parts of the academy really as a racialized way of basically supporting a certain kind of anti-Afrofeminism. And so I just wondered whether or not that part of the political discussion was something that panelists would comment on a bit, about how it is that we're able to take forward this diversity of African feminisms and Afrofeminisms in the scholarship of Africa without contributing to the ongoing kinds of marginalizations of African Americans who in some ways you've talked about are taking over parts of the space, but in other ways are also being marginalized by white Americans who study Africa. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Lisa. I also have a comment from Nancy, and then I'll do the 1 minute response. And I'm so sorry to do that to the panelists, because these are questions that clearly cannot be responded to in 1 minute. But Nancy, did you want to say something?
Hi, while I was just dropping a couple of ideas in there, thanks for the great presentation and for organizing the organizing this talk. I hope there are going to be more of them because there's a lot to be said on the subject. It was just that, I mean, I don't want to do a whole history, but there were two things around around why it's really necessary to carve out African feminism because, as in a sort of distinct way, and it's particularly on the continent, the way most women's rights issues are really taken over by the gender and development aid sort of agenda. So the sort of rooting it and grounding it in its history and politics and all of that doesn't happen in that space. So that's a particular issue, I think, for Africa and the sort of post-Beijing agenda and the directions it's gone through. And the second question was also the in that direction as well is the sort of the ideas around Pan-Africanism, which women have been very key in shaping, you know, across the sort of liberation history, and also tying back to that kind of like Pan-African, but in a feminist Pan-African visions, which would then also include these discussions about our different geographies, sub-Saharan, North, etc., etc. But I just was like throwing those two in there as an issue for maybe comment if you want to add to all the facts.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nancy. Okay, so maybe I can ask you all to say, you know, obviously you can't respond to those beautiful questions and in the complex way and the nuanced way that you've been doing it. But maybe if you want to just say one final thing before I then have the opportunity to thank you all. Can I start with you, Yolande?
As I'm thinking deeply about what I could say to wrap up, Afrofeminism, Black feminism, African feminisms are all amazing. I guess that's all I can finish with. No, I think for a very long time, I guess the thing I'm going to end with is where I go from here. For a very long time, I've struggled because feminism is not something that I came to early on in my academic career. If you had told me as a PhD student that I would be having this conversation, I would have told you you're lying. I don't have time. I'm studying war, militaries, you know? And that has changed over time, partly because of my work in policy and my ability to engage with feminists on the ground. And when I say on the ground, I'm not talking about geography. I'm really talking about feminist scholars around the world who actually do the work as opposed to intellectualizing and try to think about it the way we do sometimes in academia. And now I'm much more at peace in that space. I'm interested in how states and regional organizations conceptualize security, particularly from an African perspective. But it's okay for me to also be rooted and grounded in wanting to excavate women's spaces, particularly African spaces, African women, right to space in all these different fields. And it's difficult to have multiple research agendas from an academic perspective, because you try to produce in both and you try to link both and you try to teach both. And sometimes your brain goes into overload. But now that I've made peace in my position in that space, I don't need to be apologetic about it. And I found this point of view to actually be anchored in the scholarship, the Black scholarship from North America and the diaspora, the Caribbean and so forth, and African scholarship, African feminist scholarship, that have actually allowed me to emancipate myself from these chains of disciplinary boundaries that I'm not supposed to cross. So, yeah.
Oh, lovely, lovely closing words. Thank you so much, Yolande. Peace, can I ask you?
Can't hear you.
This every single time. Thank you all so much for these questions. I just want to say very quickly, I think that this is an ongoing conversation and it's an exciting one. And I mean, I was going to say I wish I was a PhD student, but that's a lie. I don't wish it. But I feel like there's so much, it's great being a student. There's so much there's so much work that needs to be done as these questions and our responses show. But what I want us to think about is, what do these categories allow us to do? And I'm coming back to research because I have approached African feminisms mainly as a researcher. What if we separate, if we are like, these are the different kinds of African feminisms and this is how they differ, or Afrofeminism, what does it allow us to do in our scholarship? Does it allow us to produce a new kind of knowledge that is transformative? Does it allow us, so as a feminist political scientist, does it give me certain tools? So instead of African feminisms, if I talk about Afrofeminism or some subdivision within African feminisms, is it going to give me certain tools to challenge the status quo, to develop new methodologies, to produce knowledge, like I said, that is transformative? I think those are very exciting questions, because I want to know, what can we do with all of these new terms, or once they become new terms and new ways of thinking about things? How are we going to use them to advance scholarship that is emancipatory, scholarship that is transformative? I think that's one exciting thing for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peace. Can I ask you, Tony, to go? Because you're in the next window.
Right. Thanks. I guess I'm just going to piggyback on Yolande and Peace's points. I think, how, I sort of think of Nancy and Lisa's questions as, how do we liberate the sort of constraints that, we want to remove, but then we sort of reinforce in this process of researching and engaging with others. But I think perhaps the productive way to sort of move forward is to sort of think about, not thinking within the boundaries of, say, gender and development, because I completely agree with Nancy in that sense, but, to rediscover, to be willing to understand that, what we're talking about, what we're thinking of, however we choose to define it, is this sort of co-constitutive project that is both an excavation of what is already there, an acknowledgement that we are also part of that process of knowing, and sort of a commitment to think differently about knowledge production, both in terms of how we live in the current context, but also how we do research. But I think that this process is, they speak to each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. Simidele?
Thank you. I was hoping I wouldn't be last.
Sorry.
Now I'm like, what everyone said.
Yeah.
But yeah, so thank you. Again, thank you to everyone for the comments and, the questions. I think, what can I say that hasn't been said? I think again, it was Tony, I think I said right at the outset that African feminisms are made. And I think, already we've been talking about it in the plural. So let's also emphasize that clearly they're multiple, they're contested. I do think, I was thinking just in terms of what Peace was saying about, the question of, that we also need to reflect on what do some of these kind of terms and conceptual categories and new ones do, what do they offer, so maybe a sort of more pragmatic kind of line of thought there. And it made me think also that I do think also perhaps we also maybe need to sometimes resist this kind of search for the new as well, and I think certainly as academics, we kind of know this, that, that there is also a kind of impulse to proliferate categories and so on, and conceptualizations where maybe there isn't actually need to do so. So yeah, as I said at the outset, for now, I'm an African feminist, that's where I am. But again, what the content of that is, I think is constantly in process and under construction. And again, it's contingent, I think. And I think yeah, I think we sort of, we do a dance, I think, and we should. Right, we need to kind of resist a certain kind of fixing or closing of what something like African feminism or even African feminisms are.
Thank you so much. I realize that in you know, in inventing this event and in thinking about who I wanted to start having a conversation, in a way I was you know, putting so many issues into the mix, and you all did a brilliant job of sort of like bringing out the complexity of each and every one of those. You know, I was so inspired by the conversations, but also realized that actually anything called, you know, from Africana feminisms, which I often teach on as well, just to add one more into our mix, or you know, or Afro-pessimism or Afro-pessimist feminism. I mean, there's so many categories that we can think about the knowledge project that Tony made reference to. And I again, it's so ambitious to try and have an hour and a half you know, panelist and discussion that is on such complex issues and such transnational conversations and literatures. So thank you very much for being patient and doing that. It's been fantastic, and I just want to thank you panelists all for your contributions and your willingness to sort of make links across what everyone said. And thank you so much for the participants. I think the last set of questions were really talking about the politics of naming African or African or Afrofeminisms and what that might actually look like on the ground. So I think in a way we came back to some of the important questions that you all raised about the, you know, about grounding this work, about about the political implications of this work, and you know, the women's lives in particular that much of this is referencing. So yeah, thank you very much for doing that. Thank you to everyone who participated and listened, and thank you very much to Lucia for making everything go so smoothly and so easily. I think there's lots of thank yous in the chat.
I've also added a link, that a list that was curated by Dr. Awino Okech on African feminism scholarship. So if people want to click on that and get some resources.
I know, I think that I immediately wanted to do part 2 and part 3 of this conversation. So, so stay tuned. Maybe we'll make this like a, you know, quarterly event. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.